Welcome to the Voices for Change presentation of Children, the Forgotten Victims of Intimate Partner Violence. I'm Tracy Schott. I'm a filmmaker and social worker, and I created Voices for Change to provide survivors of intimate partner violence and the professionals who support them with a platform to share their wisdom. The Voices for Change virtual tour is a monthly webinar series highlighting organizations from around the country to explore topics related to intimate partner violence. Today, we are broadcasting live from Des Moines, Iowa, along with our presenting partners, Children and Families of Iowa, the Iowa Coalition for Collective Change, and the Iowa Department of Human Services. Today's webinar is sponsored by Children and Families of Iowa. So today we're joined by Janice Schroeder, CEO of Children and Families of Iowa, Luane Nelson-Brown, Executive Director of Iowa Coalition for Collective Change, Tracy White, Supervisor at Iowa Department of Human Services, JoAnna Davis, a social worker and survivor of both childhood and adult intimate partner violence, and Lindsay, a survivor of intimate partner violence who continues to face many challenges in trying to keep her child and herself safe from her abuser. You can learn more about our panelists on our website, voicesforchange.net. So let's get started. In the United States, more than 15 million children witness intimate partner violence at least once in their lifetimes. The impact of growing up with domestic violence can be devastating, including increased risk of child abuse, anxiety and behavioral disorders, and the likelihood of continuing the cycle of abuse as adults. However, we frequently see domestic violence organizations and children's services at odds in their approaches to intervention. In this webinar, we will look at the devastation to children and families caused by domestic violence and work to redefine safety planning to ensure the safety of both children and victims of intimate partner violence. Janice, tell us a bit about Children and Families of Iowa and its work to address domestic violence.
I think it's a topic that's rarely discussed separately, but definitely needed. Children and Families of Iowa is an organization with a long history of advocacy for children. In our humble beginnings, a group of educators, ministers, and community stakeholders wanted to make a difference in the lives of children that were abused, abandoned, and neglected, to create those forever homes. So whether that be through supporting bio families, through kinship, or through foster care. So many of our programs that we offer to families are very interconnected. Mental health, childcare, career planning, training, and placement. Those that are involved in the child welfare system, and again, those that are receiving services through our domestic violence program. So we have been providing domestic violence services since 1979, and literally it was an aligning with support through the Polk County Coalition of Battered Women. And they wanted CFI to be a part of this process, a part of this program, and to take on the program. So since that time, we've worked hard to advocate for kids and to meet the needs of survivors of domestic violence here in Polk County and Warren County, and trying to work collaboratively with others involved in the domestic violence shelter, or as trying to say, accessing domestic violence services across the state. So our work really includes working with the family. It's about safety, it's about engagement, support, reducing barriers and obstacles that are preventing survivors from feeling safe and being safe, and recognizing that it takes time and that we are here to walk with victims of DV. So when I think about where we are as a society, as it relates to awareness regarding DV and resources, and then I think what has happened on a national level with Gabby, what do we need to do to get the attention of law enforcement, the faith community, family members, school officials? And I say school officials because when I think about kids that are in the homes or settings where DV is occurring, sometimes the only constant in the life of a child is their school teacher or the school counselor or their Sunday school teacher or the neighbor next door. So as we do the work, here's what we know. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported in homes where violence between partners occurs, there's a 45 to 60% chance of co-occurring child abuse. That children witness 68 to 80% of domestic violence assaults. Children who witness DV or are victims of abuse themselves are at serious risk for long-term physical or mental health problems. And children who witness violence between parents may also be at greater risk of being violent in their future relationships. And that children may be prone to dating violence, delinquency, further victimization, and involvement in child welfare and juvenile justice. Thus, the need for more awareness and supportive services for children that are impacted by domestic violence.
Thanks, Janice. That information is, I appreciate all those statistics, and it's overwhelming when you think about the numbers of children who are exposed to domestic violence and the impact, the long-term and short-term impact on them. When you first were describing children and families of Iowa, one of the things that I kept thinking and that struck me was all of the different services that you're providing under the umbrella of your organization, and how important that is that these different services are working together. And one of the problems I think that we see too frequently in this work is this sense of, well, the catchword these days is silos, right?
Right.
And that people are working at, in their own little worlds and
Yes.
not working with each other, and how helpful it is to have so many services that can work together toward the same goal under the same roof. And it provides, actually, I think, a great model for the work that we're doing in this arena. So since the pandemic started, have you seen changes in the last year or so?
Definitely. So over the past 18 months since the pandemic started, I never thought we would still be at this point as it relates to the pandemic. So I would say so many revelations and lessons learned on how we must stay connected and to support those we serve and to never forget about the kids. So during this period of time, DV has been termed the silent pandemic within the pandemic. And so this discussion today, we're painfully looking at the forgotten victims, the kids. So what we saw happening is virtual learning for kids in their home, okay? So personal movement limited, people confined to their homes due to the stay-at-home orders to prevent the spread of the virus, but it also left the kids at home. Victims were trapped with their abusers. So although we saw the numbers coming into the shelter, they were lower, but with our communication with some of the victims, they were also saying they needed the connectivity, they needed the support. So some of the restrictions that were in place also specifically stated that we could only have a certain number of people in a group type setting. Well, this made it difficult for individuals to connect with us for some of the supportive services. The connections within our community, our community partners, the resources, the referrals. There were some restrictions and some of the things were placed on hold. And then virtual platforms may have been difficult for victims to access. So other challenges that we saw was parents trying to arrange childcare, securing and maintaining employment was difficult. And one of the biggest issues, the mental health needs. The mental health needs for the victims, but also the impact of the isolation and stress on the kids, very evident. And that was layered with the social injustices for people of color as they tried to access the system.
Yeah, so we took an already difficult situation that has historically been difficult, and it's just been compounded by the stressors brought on by the pandemic and continue to be so. And it's something that we all need to be aware of. It's a good reason to end all of this, right? Luana, I wanted to talk with you a little bit. You, put you up there. You told me when we first met that you became a domestic violence advocate when you were 5 years old, which blew my mind. Tell us about that. How did that happen?
Yes, that's true. I became an advocate of sorts at age 5, just by nature of the way that I was living at the time. We lived in Milwaukee at the time. Shout out to Wisconsin folks out there. And we were homeowners, but we were also landlords. And my mother was very adamant about caring for the community. And so we oftentimes had survivors of intimate partner violence renting the downstairs apartment underneath us. And in one particular case, when I was 5, the family living underneath us was, it was an abusive situation, and they had children my age. So they were 4 and 3, or maybe 6 and 5. We were all very close together in stair step. And whenever violence would happen, my mother and their mother had worked out a system where they could be kept safe. And part of that included me getting those kids when violence was happening and bringing them up to my room. Now, for us, it just looked like, playtime. So, you get to play with your friends and for an indefinite amount of time in your room. But instinctively, and, obviously because kids aren't stupid, we all know we all knew what it was. We didn't necessarily have the vocabulary that this is a safety plan at the time, but we knew our roles. And that's when I started. So I knew that when that happened, I would make sandwiches, little snacks. I would, go downstairs or halfway down the stairs, because I wasn't allowed to go all the way down during that time, obviously, and bring my friends up to stay in my room. Sometimes they'd spend the night. So I'd put little pallets out and we would just stay safe together. So that was truly the beginning of my advocacy. And like many advocates, I don't think my story is unique. Many of us start with our own experiences in our own communities, working through our own safety plans. And for me, I was a part of another family's safety plan on several occasions.
It's a remarkable story. It also speaks to communities taking care of themselves. You weren't using outside resources. And I remember you telling me in your community, nobody called the police.
No, that wasn't a thing. Because when you're growing up in marginalized communities, many of us do not have trust of law enforcement. It's and we've seen time and time again where law enforcement is called and both people are arrested, or the abuser is handed a piece of paper and that's it. As a matter of fact, since you and I talked last, I had a conversation with my oldest son who lives in Chicago now in an apartment building. And this very thing just happened. His neighbor was being abused and he could hear it through the wall. And several neighbors in the building called law enforcement and they showed up, gave a piece of paper and walked away. This is still happening today. And I was, witnessing this at age 5, and I won't give my full age, but I'll just say the 70s. Okay. And it is still happening. And so communities, particularly marginalized communities, figure out a way to keep themselves and each other safe by relying on each other. And that's how I grew up. That's the model that I carry today, and I encourage other people to use as well. As professionals, we can empower communities, to use their own safety planning, and they're going to do it because people find a way.
It's remarkable. And, your stories of your mom, I still want to meet her. She sounds like an amazing woman. Could you tell us just a little bit about the long-term impact of growing up, kind of being surrounded by that violence? Did that affect you?
Yes, actually it did. And initially I didn't think it had, especially since, in our home, I wasn't necessarily experiencing the violence like, my neighbors were. I thought I was just fine. And it wasn't until years later that I realized the impact that it had. Our community, our neighborhood, our block, as we call it, in our culture, our block was a relatively normal block. All homeowners, lots of children, we all played together. Parents all knew each other. We had frequent block parties. However, intimate partner violence doesn't care what your neighborhood or your block looks like, right? So experiencing that and being witness to that and becoming an advocate at such an early age really changed my worldview a lot. And it wasn't until years later that I realized I had normalized safety planning, right? So violence to me was everywhere. I thought it was a normal thing. When a homicide would happen, that to me was not shocking because it is what it is. And so I became pretty desensitized to violence, and empathy was something that I had to work on as well. So my view at age 5 turned into a worldview that violence was everywhere, and that was the way it was supposed to be. And the safety planning became a way of life for me. So the hypervigilance, the being very observant everywhere I went, the constant looking for gaslighting. I didn't even have the term gaslighting as a child, but I could describe gaslighting to you, if that makes sense. So I looked for that everywhere I went, and that's how I maneuvered about the world. It found its way into my relationships until I honestly started to do work on myself, just to improve and make myself a better person. I'm a strong believer in therapy. Janice mentioned mental health and how important it is. It's extremely important, not only for those experiencing violence, but those around the violence as well. I started therapy very early and started to delve into why I view the world the way I did. And so it took some time and some effort and some work to now realize that, there are good people everywhere. Violence isn't everywhere. But it does exist. So there's a fine balance between recognizing where violence is and that it does occur, and then also maintaining empathy and goodness and seeing the goodness in other people as well. So yes, it definitely had an effect.
We talk about adverse childhood experiences and the long-term impact. And your point is that you don't have to be the victim of violence to be impacted by the violence around you. It's really, it really is overwhelming. JoAnna, you grew up in an abusive household and witnessed domestic violence as a child. Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
Well, it began at a very young age. I lived with my mother, and my mother had relationships that were very devastating when it came to domestic violence. I witnessed a lot of that in her relationships, especially when she got involved with my stepfather. And she was a woman that, she kept silent. She really never spoke up or protected herself. And so I was kind of the child that when I would see it, I would say something to her, and her response was always, a child is to be seen and not heard. And so that truly impacted my life in the fact of, just simply not being able to really voice or share things that I had witnessed. along with the fact that my father, my biological father, was an alcoholic. So when I would go to visit with him, there was domestic violence in his home as well, because he used to beat on my stepmother, and I would have to witness that. And again, it was kind of the same thing. You're a child, and so you were to be seen and not heard. And so I wasn't able to really say much about it. It did create a lot of fear, a lot of silence, where I didn't feel that I could open up and share those things that I was experiencing. And I believe it kind of molded and shaped my future. And to this day, those are things that I can still remember very vividly. And yes, that was basically my experience growing up.
And you, it impacted you as a teen. Tell us a little bit about how those experiences of growing up in an abusive household led to your own experiences of becoming a victim of intimate partner violence.
Well, as a teen, I made a lot of poor choices. I had several relationships. I was a runaway. I found myself in a relationship with an older man looking for my father. And I had my first child at 15 and then my second one at 16. And he used to beat me to where I've had like 3 broken noses. I was stabbed in the eye with a screwdriver. I mean, I experienced tremendous domestic violence in that relationship. I had low self-esteem. I had near-death experiences in that relationship as a young teenager. And I don't know, I was very insecure. I found myself being very codependent. And then it led to just being depressed and mental breakdowns and leaving my children at home by themselves because I wanted to give up. And that's when I found myself being a product of the Department of Human Services, having my children removed. And I believe I was around 17 years old when that happened.
Your experiences really demonstrate how wide-ranging the impact can be. That you were really left to fend for yourself. And looking for, you described looking for some parental support, and then ended up in an abusive relationship, and then that impacted your mental health, and you ended up losing your children to human services. So it was, and that has had a generational impact on you. It's impacted your children as well. So one of the things I guess we've learned is that what happens to one child is it's not just contained.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Lindsay, tell us a little bit about your experience with intimate partner abuse. You were going through an abusive relationship at the same time trying to keep your own child safe. You also interacted with human services, but had maybe a better experience. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in a marriage where it was very largely based on substance abuse and a lot of emotional abuse. There was physical as well, but mostly power and control issues. I think substance abuse darkens our ability to ask for help in those situations a lot because we feel that low self-esteem, that we're not worth it, that we deserve to be treated that way. An example, when I decided to move out to Iowa to be with my ex-husband, the very first day that I got out here, I was excited, and I show up and he had hacked all my email accounts and was throwing everything about my past at me. And it was really a tool to control me It didn't become physical until a little while later. It was mainly based off of emotional and abuse, but when it did turn physical, it was mostly go straight for the throat strangulation, which really scared me because that's a very terrifying feeling. I didn't feel like I could ask for help.
And how did that how did that change when you became pregnant?
When I became pregnant, he did not touch me anymore. I think the last time was very recently to when I found out I was pregnant. The emotional abuse continued though. There's always, holes in our walls, punching right next to my head, the screaming at me, it had changed, but the physical abuse had subsided. I had a friend come out, for my baby shower, and she saw the holes in our walls. And I remember her asking me, like, this is really concerning to me. And me thinking that was normal. Like, I thought it was good that he wasn't hitting me. I thought we were doing great.
There was also the whole substance abuse piece of it that you were struggling with and trying to overcome, especially once you got pregnant. But that was also a place of manipulation and control in your relationship. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. When I had my son, I had struggled with getting clean and I became DHS involved, which honestly, it saved my life. I know a lot of people don't have that same experience, but I was really lucky. I dove into services and I really wanted to get clean. I wanted to be a good mother. But in the course of trying to keep my son out of foster care, they placed him with his dad originally. And so that was another avenue of power and control. And as I worked to get better, then it eventually came out that he was still using. And that was kind of how I was able to get my out. I started going to, that's how I found CFI, and I started going to, child parent psychotherapy with my son, and I started doing mental health services. And that's when I was introduced, my therapist had been mentioning, these aren't normal behaviors for a relationship, him tracking where you're going, him having access to all my email accounts and text messages. Like, that was when it was really brought up to me that maybe this wasn't normal behavior. And then they assigned me to a domestic violence advocate through their services as well. And that's when I kind of learned a whole lot more.
You faced some challenges in trying to leave the relationship. But you said human services getting involved actually saved your life. Could you just give us a little bit more information about how that happened?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of gray area, and there's not a lot of protection for women when you're not being in immediate danger. So leaving was difficult, especially originally when he had the custody of my son. So I didn't ever feel like I could leave, which is why I kept it secrets and didn't say anything. But when I was able to start getting better with my services, I was able to tell them what was going on in our relationship, and I was unable to get a protection order through regular law enforcement. So when I left, it started out as the honeymoon, like he was trying to get me back. So he was super nice and overly loving, and it was one of those situations. But as soon as he realized I wasn't coming back, it turned dark very, very quickly. The stalking, the harassment. He posted websites of me and linked it to my work. I almost lost my job. There was a lot of harassment. There still is. It's ongoing. And I wasn't able to get any help. So I went to I was with recovery court at the time with my DHS case. And I went to my team, and they presented a protection order through my DHS case, which was a way because it was affecting my child. I almost lost my job. I had full custody of him at that point. And so, out of out of the ordinary, I was able to get a protection order, not allowing him to continue those behaviors. And then I, of course, once the DHS case closed, that I lost that. But
the DHS role in these cases of intimate partner violence is complicated. Tracy White, the other Tracy, tell us, you've worked in human services for 20 years, over 20 years, right?
Yes.
And you've experienced firsthand conflicts between child protection and domestic violence services. Why do you feel these conflicts exist?
Well, I love Lindsay's story, and I appreciate that, because DHS should feel like help, and we don't hear that a lot. So I really appreciated that. I think that the world of domestic violence and advocates in that world have been way ahead of DHS in terms of advocating for the victim and the whole family. With DHS, our primary goal is the protection of the child. And historically, that the safety planning we've done around that has not been hugely productive. And I think that's where we butt heads, that we haven't done a good job of recognizing what safety planning can look like Luana talked about. Typically for us, safety planning is leave him, get your own place, get a no contact order, don't let him in. And we know now, so we've been working over the last 5 years to embrace the safe and together model. So we're learning a lot more now about why all of those things that constituted typical safety planning are ineffective, they do not work, and they're not fair to the victim and to the children. So we're trying to learn, but I think that's where that juncture is where we've kind of butt heads, that we're trying to protect the child and we haven't given a nod to more atypical safety planning and what that can look like.
And my guess is when you really examine the numbers of the statistics of your client base, that domestic violence is probably part of maybe a majority of your cases.
Well, actually, I looked up a few statistics too. So in 2020, in the state of Iowa, we did 30,150 child abuse assessments. 33% of those were founded. 53% involved the category of child abuse that includes domestic violence. We know that that's not an accurate representation because domestic violence is often co-occurring with many other categories of child abuse. So absolutely, I would put it probably closer to about 80%.
That really speaks to the need for human services professionals to have a deep dive understanding of domestic violence issues.
Absolutely. And we, in the state of Iowa, we have, over the course of the last few years, as I mentioned, we have embraced the safe and together model. And so we're looking at, there's 3 basic principles there, and that is keeping the children safe and together with the non-offending parent, partnering with the non-offending parent as our default position. So instead of saying, if you don't leave, we're taking the kids out, we have to find a better way of partnering with the non-offending parent. And we have to intervene with the perpetrator to reduce the risk and harm to the child. So we're going to be looking at the perpetrator is the one that is causing the issues in the family. So as opposed to blaming, doing more of blaming the victim, we have to put the onus over onto the perpetrator, that the perpetrator is making choices that place his children in harm. The victim is responding to those choices. And we have to do a better job of recognizing that the victim's response oftentimes is incredibly safe and appropriate. So we're working hard to convey that down to our workers in the field, that safety can be, you turn on a light above your kitchen sink when you're getting ready to have a problem and your neighbor knows that's a signal, much like Luana and her family did. That neighbor's going to come over and help you. Safety can be, through the course of a storm in her home, that mom got her kids up and out to school every single day, that she got those kids to the doctor. That isn't a just, you're a mom, you should do that. You were a mom living in a storm and you did that. That's amazing. So we have to provide different context to the victim's experiences, and we have to provide and shine a brighter lens on the perpetrator's behaviors.
Thank you for that. That's, yeah. I think, anybody who has experienced any kinds of depression or anxiety or mental health issues can speak into that and understand how hard it can be sometimes just to get yourself out of bed and get yourself dressed. But then when you have children and you have to create a normal life for them as you just aptly described it, a storm, I think we all need to develop much greater empathy for these moms, mostly moms.
Yeah.
Luana, I'd like to talk with you about the Iowa Coalition for Collective Change. You work with marginalized communities. So could you tell us a bit about that work and the extra layers of danger that is experienced by these communities?
Yes, absolutely. So the Coalition for Collective Change, we're the homicide and violent crime coalition for the state of Iowa. And our work consists mainly of training and certifying other advocates across the state of Iowa to work directly with survivors, particularly in marginalized communities. We were founded at the intersection of anti-oppression and violence. Anti-oppression being racism, sexism, homophobia, all of the isms that we know, right? And so our organization was founded with the understanding that oppression actually is violence. So when you are coming from a marginalized community and you experience racism at every level, every day, through microaggressions, through lack of access to services, through even a sense of a lack of belonging, those are actually violent acts, and those are acts that affect people long term. So now you add that on top of experiencing intimate partner violence, and it's compounded trauma. Another thing that we never really think about as we're providing services or attempting to provide services is the historical trauma that goes along with being exposed to various institutions. And I love that Tracy White is on with us. She and I are friends, and everything I'm about to say now, she won't hold against me. But DHS is such a beautiful example of what I mean when I talk about historical trauma and the layers there. When you think about how DHS has traditionally done work, as Tracy mentioned, focusing on the safety of the child and creating the definition of what safety looks like, as opposed to using the definition of that family and ultimately that community, has been something that DHS has struggled with in the past. If you take the African American community, which is one of the communities we work with, and obviously the community I come from, the history of the removal of children is not something we can ignore, right? Those were violent acts that have happened throughout the past 400 years to our community. And so it can be viewed as continuing that practice that started during slavery, when people's bodies and the bodies of parents and children were used for profit under the guise of safety. That's what it feels like when you hail from a marginalized community. So that level of trust that you would think would be there is not, and rightfully so. So you add on another layer of having the safety plan, not only from your perpetrator, but also from the systems that you interact with that are supposed to help you. And when that happens, then where do you go? And this is why lots of marginalized communities rely on one another to safety plan, keep each other safe, and do not really allow access into the community by other entities that are trying to help. Because There's no representation in most of our institutions. So when we look at advocates, we look at DHS workers, we look at law enforcement, it's important for people to see themselves reflected. And that's not often the case. And people don't speak the language. And so if there's no real relationship built, then you're asking people to yet again trust you, which is entering into a relationship with you that could potentially be abusive as well, unbeknownst to you as the caregiver. So many extra layers involved when intimate partner violence strikes marginalized communities.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that a little bit more. And, unfortunately, of course, the statistics show that marginalized communities are more likely to die from intimate partner violence than Caucasian and Asian communities, right? So, we're not serving the community to protect the way we're supposed to be protecting. And how do we do better? I want to bring everybody back on screen. JoAnna, I think about your story. I think about you being a child, having two children, and being a victim of violence yourself. But the response from DHS at that time, and that was a number of years ago, was to remove the children from you. But was there any protection offered to you?
No. In fact, my children were placed with my abuser. And that was very devastating because I felt defeated. So to even look for support, I thought it was hopeless. I didn't think that there was anything available. And at that time, that was some years ago. I won't tell my age, but it was some years ago. And so for me to, and again, at that time I was 17, so I didn't have an education. I was very codependent, and it just looked like a hopeless cause for me.
So you were a child with children, but nobody really looked out for your well-being.
No, not at all.
Tracy, I assume that that would be handled differently today. What are some of the safeguards that you're taking in those situations where you have kind of those complex situations of abuse, multi-generational?
I really appreciate the question. We, in addition to bringing the Safe and Together curriculum and training to our workers, part of that model is we have a Connect and Protect team. So we have an ability, and we've pulled together survivors, we've pulled together the Department of Human Services, our providers, advocates. When we have a complicated case with domestic violence at its core, we have an ability to take those cases to that team, to staff together, so that we can, again, they're holding us accountable to looking at safety planning in a different way, which is hugely important. The department worked very closely with Janice and her shop to talk to the community about what they need from us. And one of the things they needed was a team of African-American professionals to hear our cases. So we also take complicated cases with African-American kiddos who've been removed and present them to the African-American case consultation team. So again, and that's a committee comprised of Black professionals from the community, from domestic violence, therapists, education, faith-based organizations. So both of those venues are an opportunity to talk about complicated cases, for our workers and supervisors to be educated about what they can do differently. We also, again, partnering with Luane, we've brought Luane in to do some training for our service area related to historical trauma, because she's absolutely right. In Polk County alone, if you're a Black child, you are almost 4 times more likely to be removed from your family, and that same amount likely to never be reunified. So I think DHS we also work with Janice and her shop with the Parent Partner Program. So we match parents who have had their children removed with parents who are recently having their children removed, so they can model for them how to advocate for themselves within our system. And when you are a survivor of domestic violence, that is very hard, extra multi-layered, hard to do, because it's hard enough if you're not. So we really value and appreciate the opportunity to do that. So we've embraced, over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, a variety of mechanisms to really change our practice. When I talk about it, I know I'm talking about best case. Every time I talk about it, there's going to be folks that will say, that didn't happen to me. And my goal is for more folks than not to say, you know, that did happen to me. And DHS was a help. So those are a few of the things that we're trying to embrace to change our ways.
I mean, in the end, I've known lots of children protective services workers. I mean, you're not in it for the money or the glory. You're in it to keep children safe. And so it's hard to hear the criticisms and respond to them. But it seems like you guys have done a great job of incorporating, you know, those criticisms into a different way of operating. So I think that's it's a great model. Lindsay, you know, you did have the support of DHS, so much so that you were able to, you know, get custody of your son and you're kind of discharged from them. And now you're kind of struggling on your own to continue to keep your child safe. What advice would you give to survivors of intimate partner violence who are trying to keep their children safe as well as themselves out of those abusive relationships? What thoughts do you have?
I feel like the biggest part of that for me is that community. You know, I still am very adamant about engaging in services. I still go to therapy myself. I am still very adamant about my son going to therapy. And every time something comes up where I feel like he might be, you know, struggling with understanding, like why dad isn't here, why, you know, we explained his dad's sick and he's not healthy for you to be around. You know, I have a therapist to help me navigate that. And that's a really big deal for me. I do have a safety plan that I'd worked out with my domestic violence advocate. The foster family that had custody of my son is very active in my life, and they are aware of, you know, all the safety planning and the situation there. So I always have an out. However, my son's never really been around that, but my number one goal is to keep him out of that. That's a really big deal for me. You know, his dad still wants to come around to be in his life, but I cannot condone that behavior to my son. And although it's harder to do it on my own, I feel like my son is safe and he's happy. And, you know, he had a lot of issues after, you know, the separation and being removed from dad. And we're finally getting to a place where, you know, he's solid and he's trusting and he knows mom's not going to go away again. And, you know, those are really important things to keep my child safe, not only physically, but mentally as well. I think that's one of the biggest struggles is how do you help him, you know, heal from all that trauma?
Yeah, you're speaking a lot to the, you know, using the services that are out there. And the reality is, you know, Children and Families of Iowa is not alone in being out there as an organization providing services. Not every area is as robust as what you guys are providing, but the importance of having a support system as you try to navigate this, I guess, cannot be understated. JoAnna, you know, your story really demonstrates how intimate partner violence impacts families for generations. So what are your thoughts about ending the cycle of violence?
So I believe in order to end the cycle of violence is exactly some of the things that I'm already doing. And that is being a voice for others when they're in those type of situations, helping them, supporting them and giving them, you know, community tools and just resources. And part of that is I'm currently a social worker, and I work with many families in the Department of Human Services. So it's kind of like a big turnaround for me, in the sense of helping end the cycle of violence, and being that support, being someone that has had the experience of that, and to be able to lead people and guide people to the resources and different things that are out there. I've had many, many years of experience just doing that. And I think that that's a huge key to helping end that cycle of violence, especially when we're talking generational, because again, I see my life and many others that I've worked with have success stories like that. And that was based on just people not being silent any longer and speaking up and sharing their stories and helping each other with the resources that are out there.
You are really talking about the power of sharing your story, and that's been one of the things that I've been beating the drum about ever since I got involved in this arena, this space, is that survivor stories are the most powerful change agent for bringing awareness, but also for connecting to other survivor experiences and helping them grow. So thank you so much for bringing your wisdom back to your community and also sharing it with us. Luana, your mother demonstrated the importance of community in keeping children safe. So how do we take some of those lessons into today's world?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, she really did. As we were landlords, she was very adamant on renting to survivors. And the reason she did that is because she had a model that worked, right? And it really wasn't just my mother. She incorporated the entire family. So we all had a role in assisting. So my role was always to take care of the children. We had a dog that was in our back hallway, and my sister's job was to man the dog. My mother was a nurse, and so she took care of whoever the survivor was, both medically and emotionally, and my father took care of the perpetrator. So all of us within our own little environment and our own community had a role to play. We knew what that role was. It built off of each of our strengths, and we knew what to do. That's a model that can be replicated in every community, right? Those are lessons that we can take as we're doing our work, and we can replicate. We can start thinking about, what does it look like to empower communities, to empower neighbors, to empower neighborhoods. And that's going to take a multifaceted angle, right? We've got to look at policy. We've got to look at laws. We've got to look at culture change. And I think if we keep at the center of it, what my mother always kept at the center was maintaining people's human dignity. Then I think we start there. A good friend of mine and I recently have had lots of conversations around just plain old human dignity, because one of the things that you lose in an intimate partner violence situation, or really any violent situation, you're clinging to dignity, right? So we can start thinking about those strategies that empower communities. We can start investing in communities and start keeping human dignity at the center, and use that in our work. Tracy White mentioned, how they're now incorporating this panel. I can't remember what it's called, the African American Professional Panel to review cases. That is an excellent, excellent start. Investing in those folks is also important. So I don't know if they get paid, but they probably should. This is where we start to look at where we're investing, and investments always include resources. And so maybe it's time for us to start reevaluating where our investments go. Are they going into communities and families, or are they going into bureaucracy, right? So my mother and our family, we did everything we did with no funding. However, we did have assets. So we were providing housing, first and foremost. We were providing food if we needed to, and everything else now, that people needed. That's a comprehensive model that if we took all of the funding that we have right now and started looking at how we reinvest that funding and pour into our communities, then that will start to make a difference. Wherever that funding goes, wherever your money goes, instinctively, we think that's where the value lies. So if the value lies on the expertise of a panel from a community, and or the value lies in our families and children, we should be able to point to our budget and see that that's where the value lies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And you talk about the fact that everybody has a role to play. I love the fact that, in your family, a 5-year-old had a job.
Yeah.
And your father had a job.
Mm-hmm.
And the job of staying safe and keeping children safe was not just one person. It was not just the victim. It was the whole community. And when those words come out of my mouth, I have goosebumps. I believe very strongly that it is going to take the whole community to change the horrific statistics that we have around intimate partner violence. And this model is so important. So we're kind of like wrapping up here. And Janice, I just want to circle back to you. So as a leader in Iowa Family Services, right, what are some of the changes we need to be making to ensure the safety of both children and victims of intimate partner violence?
So I'm just thinking about what I've heard. And I mean, literally the fact that we're all here together and we're all speaking the same language. So it's how we can, again, as you mentioned earlier, get out of the silos, all of us being more observant. So if we see something that does not appear to be safe or healthy for a child, that we reach out and we ask what's going on. Also that we're listening to each other. So as we are all a part of different systems, kind of taking those nuggets today and moving them forward. How can we have more intentional conversations so that kids can get the services that they need, so that victims of domestic violence, we maintain their dignity and we help keep kids and families when it is safe to do so. So we're all recognizing we cannot do this work alone. It's going to take all of us working together to do this, because we all want kids to be safe, we want kids to be healthy, and we want them to thrive. So and not be in that more survival mode. So I'd like to put out a call to action to everyone today to be a part of the solution and use your voice and use your energy to help us end domestic violence.
Thank you so much. Everybody else gets 1 minute for any final thoughts, final words of wisdom.
Well, I want to echo what Janice said. So this is my first time meeting Lindsay, and I'm like, Lindsay, come on, let's be a parent partner. JoAnna was a parent partner. She works here. I've had relationships with Janice and Luane. I think those relationships have caused us all to come together. We have a common purpose. DHS has a lot of work to do, and I'm always willing to fall on the sword of that. But I know that I am working with the right people, and that's this group. And I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I want to take accountability, and we want to be better. So, and this effort is part of that as well. So thank you so much for letting us be part of it.
I think we are making great progress when it comes to ending, violence and really just listening and hearing those that are going through, the domestic violence. I know that I did parent partner for almost 11 years, a little bit over 11, and now I'm working for the Department of Human Services. And I think that just with those things, we're, like we said earlier, we're all working together and we're on the same common goal to end this. So that would be my final thoughts on it, is that we are doing we're definitely dealing with it, and things are changing.
I think that we are moving in the right direction, and I definitely applaud the work that Tracy at DHS does and Janice at CFI does. That's not work that you typically see around the country. I think that as we move toward breaking down silos, that's really where we need to be. And then considering the fact that our communities are yet another silo. Mm-hmm. And so when we come together in partnership, like we said a little bit ago, everyone has a job to do, and you can do that in collaboration. I think that's what we need to move toward to start to see an end to intimate partner violence, and really redefining what safety looks like on our terms as human beings.
I think there is progress, but I think that we're definitely not there yet. There is such a huge gap with law enforcement, I feel like. There's so many, and I know that every state is different. I can say for sure that Iowa is having some gaps in protecting those that aren't in immediate danger. And I understand that, of course, those that are in immediate danger need to have, access first. But I do feel like there's so much, there's no protection for the harassment. There's no protection for stalking. And a lot of these things lead to more serious abuse, especially when you've come from that situation. So as being somebody who's still dealing with it every day, it's kind of frustrating because we have all of these resources and all of these wonderful, this coalition that we have, that I've gotten so much help from, but I do feel like there is still a lot of work to be done. And I am bound and determined to find it.
That's awesome. So we've got work to do. We're not done yet. But the work that you guys are doing is inspiring, and I am quite sure that our audience is going to agree with me on that. Thank you for joining the Voices for Change virtual tour. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Children and Families of Iowa, for presenting today's tour. To learn how you can sponsor a webinar, please contact us at info@voicesforchange.net. For more information on this and other resources available for training for law enforcement, criminal justice professionals, nurses, and domestic violence advocates, please visit us at voicesforchange.net. Thank you.